Welcome back, everyone, to our second part of the ransomware incident investigation. I have Corina, of course, back with me, and I hope everyone watched the first part, because in the first part, we actually looked into how this ransomware attack looks like, where you start, and we did the initial scoping and understanding what entities have been impacted. And we are in the middle of investigating. We investigated a user, and we keep going investigating the next piece. But I don't say too much because Corina knows all the details. So Corina, take us to the next steps. And before, say simply who you are for those that maybe just joined for the second part.
Hi, everyone. Nice to be here again for the second part of our ransomware investigation. I'm Corina Feuerstein. I'm a product management lead on the Microsoft 365 Defender product team. And I am here to continue our interesting ransomware investigation. We left off last time. If you remember, for those of you who saw on the previous episode, we were following the ransomware playbook that we have in the system. We were in the investigation stage, basically following the current situation assessment steps, and we just completed looking at the compromised account in this attack and concluded that it was disabled by the disruption, automatic disruption, and we looked around and we didn't find any activity by it before the disruption kicked in that was not represented here in the incident and maybe needed to be added in. So with that, we're going to go to the next step, which is identifying the ransomware process. Ta-da! All right, so this is the core of the thing. So what do we do here? We're going to use advanced hunting in this case, and we're going to use a query that is provided here in the playbook to look for this ransomware process. The ransomware process meaning this is the actual process that was trying to perform encryption in this attack.
So is this now a pre-populated query already, or do we create our own one here?
That's right. It is pre-populated, and the playbook actually provides the exact query that we need to execute, and advanced hunting will come up with the pre-populated content. So let's see how this looks like. We can see the query here. It is predefined. It looks for any alert evidence with the timestamp in the area of the time that the attack happened. Actually, I should say I modified this time area. So the query initially comes up with some default time, and you do need to provide the time that you're interested in. I'm searching for any alerts where the attack technique, and this is the MITRE technique that is mapped to these alerts, contains the words data encrypted. This is the MITRE technique name for encryption type processes. Yes.
Yeah. I was wondering how that query can create something so general for like, search for this file and search for this file. No, okay, we are looking for attack techniques.
Attack technique, exactly. This is cool because our alerts are mapped to techniques. They represent some activity that the attacker performed that is representing a technique. And because we have them mapped, we can actually hunt by techniques rather than by specific alerts.
But you are looking for an alert. So you're not looking for a process on a machine timeline or something. So you are looking for an alert that was raised because of that attacker technique.
Right. So in this case, I'm quite clear that because the system identified this incident as a ransomware incident, then it must have identified ransomware activity. And I'm kind of doing it in a sneaky way. I'm looking for detections from the system about this ransomware activity. And then I will look in those alerts to find the evidence, which will be the process that was involved and other types of evidence. There will be cases, maybe, hopefully, like, maybe you catch the attack in a stage where it's done all the initial pre-ransom phase, and it didn't actually do anything that's specific to that second phase, which is the ransom phase. And in that case, we wouldn't have alerts that are specific for this technique, right? But we could then look for it different ways. It's a little bit more in, involved, but we could follow basically the last activity that we saw and look around that with tools like the timelines and the hunting for things that will help us find the payload in case it's there but wasn't detected. So
Yeah, I mean,
we can
also
see.
because a
Mhm.
lot of these attacks are, they don't even include any malware anymore, like file. Like it's what are you looking for then? Like it's
Exactly, exactly. So let's see actually what happened here, right? So I ran this query, and what I got is 28 different items. I'm querying the alert evidence table, which is actually, it has multiple entries per alert because there can be multiple evidence for each alert. And we see here the different types of entities that were found. There'll be machines and users and files, and some of them are in the impacted role, some are related. But really what we care about is the alert IDs for these alerts. In this case, we can see that all of this evidence actually is from two distinct alerts. And I'm going to drill into one of these to see what I can find there.
Mhm.
When I click on that, I will get to the alert page.
There were a lot of different entities, so machine, user, file, processes. They all still bring us back to that same place.
Yeah, that's right. That number we saw was actually the alert ID and the multiple rows, they all belong to the same alert. It's just different evidence items in that alert. So we actually saw two groups of this GUID. One was belonging to one alert and the other to the other. So I just used one of them. Probably it would, even both of them would bring me to the same area. Here we are looking at this alert, and we see this alert is a ransomware behavior detected in the file system. This is on the device CL101 that we were investigating or seeing before. It's one of those that we isolated, remember, because we were like the paranoid person that wants to be sure. No, cautious, let's call it cautious. And let's see what we see here. So here's the ransomware behavior. We see actually a process tree. This shows us a very detailed process tree of the activities that happened on this device before and after the alert that we selected. So the alert that we selected is highlighted with the blue here, and it actually triggered on activity that says cmd.exe renamed 105 .lockbit files. So this looks like encryption, which is why it was alerted on. It also means that this device is actually impacted, unfortunately, and it had files encrypted. But it is the only one that was affected, because we remember that shortly after this happened, the disruption kicked in, the attacker was isolated, and the account was disabled, and they managed to get farther because we don't see more devices in the incident.
So what did the file do now? Okay, the file was renamed to then lockbit.
File rename just means it was encrypted. You can see here that this file was an Excel
Hmm.
spreadsheet, computational approaches to study impact of environmental factors of life. It's just a .xlsx file. That was the original file name. And the represented kind of renamed file is the same with the lockbit extension. This is a typical pattern in file encryption. The attacker encrypts the files and basically creates a new copy of it or renames it with the extension of the ransomware.
Okay. Okay.
So now there are 105 of these. It doesn't list all of them here. It just gives us one for example, but it's clear that this is actually the encryption activity. Now we can actually go and look at how did this happen. So another thing that we realize here, in addition to the fact that there's encryption going, is that the process that performed this activity is cmd.exe. It's just a command prompt.
There we have the fileless.
Yes, exactly. So this is a fileless ransomware attack, meaning there's no ransomware payload per se. It's actually just a fileless scenario. But let's see, why did this happen? So we can walk up the tree and see other activities that happened before this that led to this activity. We can see some net config and nbstat. These are reconnaissance type activities or discovery. You see that they are also alerted with the suspicious system network configuration discovery. Before that, we see psexec SVC service. Now, psexec is the target service in the psexec tool. Psexec is a tool that is used often. It's also used by administrators normally, but it's also often used by in attacks for lateral movement because it's a remote execution tool. You can basically use it to do remote execution. So this indicates that there was remote execution happening here, and we can also see it by the alert that happened here, which is the suspicious remote activity. And we can see it was dropped remotely from this IP and executed on this device. So this tells us that the entire thing on this device actually occurred remotely from the attacker device. This IP address is the IP address of the device we saw that was contained.
We don't see this here though,
What, that it's contained?
that this IP belongs to that device and that that device is connection cut off.
Yeah, so we can see because this is not an onboarded device, then we just identify it by an IP address, right? But we saw it as a device in the graph, and in the graph we were able to see that it was contained. We can also take action on the IP address itself, and we will do this actually as part of remediation because the containment, remember, that was like a temporary measure for the disruption took in order to stop everything and let us continue our investigation in peace. But now we know this is the attacker IP. We will want to add it as an indicator so that it's blocked everywhere, anywhere, and anywhere where it's seen.
Okay. So you can do this right from here, say add an indicator and then basically go through the wizard of the indicator, block it, allow it, device groups or whatever is
Exactly.
available. Okay.
Yes, I can give it a name. I can describe what it does. I can even decide on the action. Obviously, in this case, I will do a block. And I can also give details of the alert that would be generated if we ever encounter this IP trying to access the environment again.
Again.
We can call it command and control. Here is where we can even map our own custom alert to a MITRE technique, right? So it's similar to any out of the box alert. I can pick something here. I'll just pick something. And we can even provide the recommended actions in case this is hit. Yeah, and this just tells you like the scope and finally generates the indicator. So in conclusion, what we did in this stage, we looked for the ransomware process. We found that actually there is no ransomware process, or there is a process, but it's not actually a ransomware file. It's a cmd.exe that was made to do bad things remotely, but from the attacker's device. And this gives us some hints about what we should do for remediation, because if there is a ransomware payload, you would typically maybe try to quarantine it on all the devices where it's found. But since here we don't have a payload, there's no point in quarantining cmd.exe, of course. So we would need to just make sure that this IP of the remote device that the attacker used cannot access anything anymore. So let's go back to our playbook.
Yes. So quickly, because you said we want to make sure they can't connect again from that IP address. I mean, they could change it. And so we also need to make sure they don't have access to the user credentials anymore. But I think because right now the user is disabled, so we will do some cleanup there later, right?
Yes, that's right. So let's see what basically we completed our investigation, concluded our investigation, and now we are in the eradication and recovery stage. So let's see what the playbook tells us to do for recovery or remediation. So first of all, it tells us to verify if we have backups for that one device that was hit, yes. And then it tells us to add indicators funny because
You
that's
already
exactly
did.
what we were doing before, right? So we need to add any indicators that we found into the indicators list. We did it for this IP. If we found in the bigger investigation that there's more attacker infrastructure that we identified, like other IP locations or internet locations, we would add those into indicators as well.
Yeah.
And if we have a firewall or proxy server, it's good measure to also, of course, add those IPs and indicators there as well, so that it's completely covered from anywhere.
And there comes my password reset. Yay.
Exactly. Here's the reset compromised users, right? So our user disable, we can go back to them. Remember, we had it disabled. Now we have to do something to re-enable it. First, we want to make sure that the attacker cannot use it anymore. And so we have actions for the user right here. We can take these actions from the user page where we are now. We can also take them from the graph, the incident graph, and we can also take these from the assets and evidence and response tabs. So there are many places depending on where it's best for you to do it, and it will have the
So
same effect.
I would do a forced password reset and I would do a require user sign in and then
Exactly.
enable it again.
Exactly. So we can just take those actions from here. Once the user has reset their password, we can enable the account and let them work. And now we have actually the attacker not able to use this account anymore, and the user can go back to their normal operation. Heike, I think you are becoming a really good
I know. Did you see?
security
You notice?
investigator.
Thank you. I was wondering.
So we were in the recovery. We did the reset for compromised users. So after we've done the reset of any compromised users, there are more steps here to follow. Basically, we won't go into detail about what they are about. Is isolating any other attacker control points that we might find, like, as I said, other infrastructure parts, removing malware if there was any, which there isn't in this case, the actual payload of the ransomware, and recovering files on the cleaned devices. And there's instructions here how to do that if you have OneDrive for Business or if you're just using the operating system recovery capabilities and recovering deleted email and so on. So this completes the eradication and recovery part, and we have one more piece to go, which is actually, I think, the most important one, really, because you just did a lot of work, or we just did a lot of work working this incident, understanding what happened, doing the cleanup. There were people who had to, reset passwords and whatnot. So don't we want to like prevent this stuff from happening to begin with? I think we probably do. But yeah, I mean, this is costly, right? Having these incidents is costly. Even if we are able to stop them early and prevent additional, realize like in this case, the early detection, the disruption, and the ability for the SOC analyst to go in and understand what's going on and actually eradicate the attacker and clean up means that there were many, many hundreds and thousands of
Mhm.
other devices in this organization that were saved
Yeah.
from being ransomed. So that's
Yeah.
important to note.
So for the prevention, what do we do? There is hopefully a good guidance.
Right. So what does prevention mean? It means what can we do to change or to improve the posture of this environment to actually not be susceptible to this type of threat at all. The playbook again takes us through different stages. How do we do prevention for devices, for identities, for email, and so on for this type of threat? And this is more general guidance, but we actually have a really cool feature that I want to show you, which is the recommended actions on the incident here. So if we click on that, this will give us very specific recommendations for improvements of posture
For this specific attack.
for this specific incident even. Yes. So what happens here is like every organization has a ton of recommendations for improving posture. because nobody is perfect and everyone has so many different controls and configurations that they are not ideal for security. But it's always a long list and it's always scary and hard to do. So here what we're doing is focusing those recommendations to those that are most important because they are affecting the specific type of activity that you saw in your environment, right? So this is mapping. You remember those MITRE techniques? It's mapping the techniques that were observed by this attacker
Mhm.
to the matching security controls that if you turn them on, it will be harder for the attacker or maybe even impossible to perform that technique. And it lists those kind of collects them here in one short list. So this is a much shorter list than the entire posture improvement
Yeah.
for the entire organization, but it's very pinpointed to preventing these things. And we can see that they are from different sources, right? So there are some recommendations that are for identity stuff, for Azure Active Directory controls or Defender for Identity, and there's other for endpoints. So it goes across. And for each of these, we can, of course, drill into details. We'll see exactly what is this recommendation. In this case, for example, one recommendation is use multi-factor authentication, obviously, because there was a very important account that was compromised here. And why was it compromised? Because it was probably relatively easy to do because you don't have multi-factor authentication.
So, Corinna, about multi-factor authentication, is it really that still so many customers don't have that turned on? Is this still the number one misconfiguration or missing piece out of a research statistic? Is there like what are other cases where such ransomware could be successful even if there is MFA turned on? Sorry, multiple questions into one question.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's okay. So I don't know if like it's the very top one, but it's certainly a very important one and one that we still see too many organizations that don't have it or don't have it configured in the most recommended way. And it's true, it's not 100% bulletproof, but this is true for any advanced threat, right? I mean, we always have the assumption of assume breach, meaning that a very determined attacker will find some way in. But if you make it difficult, there's a chance that they will go, if you have a really good lock, right? There's a chance that they will go to a different door, or that you will slow them down enough, or that you will be able to disrupt them, right? So you always want to be in the best posture that you can. And MFA is really like table stakes these days. It's
Yeah,
really a must,
yeah, yeah,
and it's so effective. It's not going to
yeah.
be bulletproof always, but it's going to be very effective. And we know also about, like social engineering in MFA scenarios. Sometimes an attacker will trigger an MFA and the user will think, oh, okay, dismiss, and then trigger MFA again. And after like 10 of these, the user will go like, okay, I don't like these notifications, click, fine, approve. And the
Yes,
attacker got
yes.
the credentials. So it requires more than just the setting. It requires been doing training of users to be aware and to make sure that if they get an MFA thing, then why are they getting it? Are they really trying to access something or not? And then other recommendations here are going to be for other areas. For example, there is one about an ASR rule that you should set that is preventing stealing credentials from the Windows LSAS process. Pretty rudimentary, pretty basic. Why wouldn't you turn it on? Unfortunately, this one is off by default, like some of the other ASR rules, and we are actually working actively on creating default configurations where these are on, but very important one to set and one that would prevent the attacker, for example, from once they have control on a device, from being able to dump credentials from that device for other users and use those.
Okay, so Corina, I mean, those recommendations are very specific for this incident with the techniques and tactics used for this ransomware attack. If someone wants to learn about a more generic ransomware protection. You showed us that threat analytics report before, and I think all the recommendations that are very specific to ransomware attacks are in there. Is that correct?
Exactly, yes. So here we have a smaller set of recommendations that are specific to this incident. But, ransomware incidents can vary. There could be variations. And so probably better to, if we're going to look for recommendations, to look for recommendations for the entire threat family or type of threat. So here back in the threat analytics report, we also have a recommended actions area, but here we're not talking about the specific attack that happened in this instance, but rather generally about ransomware attacks and what are the recommendations for those.
But still mapped to that organization. So it's not,
Sti-
yeah.
So here it's mapped to the type of threat, ransomware, and it gives you general, it's not all the recommendations for posture in your organization, just the ones that are specific to ransomware.
But those that are not yet configured in my organization, right?
Yes, exactly. So you will have the ones that are that you still have to configure, or maybe they are configured partially, right? Sometimes you have them on some devices, but not on others. For example, let's take an example and see if we can find one. And here I get for each of these a quick description of what it is. This is another ASR rule, for example. It tells me some details about what it is, and it takes me to manage this in M365 Defender, meaning it's going to the bigger secure score recommendations,
Mhm.
but focused on this one. So here, this actually takes us to the bigger security recommendations section in Microsoft 365 Defender, focused on this recommendation. And this is where I can actually start the process of executing it if I want to. The interesting part here is that it also tells me some insights. It tells me that in this case, no devices in this organization are configured as recommended. Sometimes we will have, like I said, partial configuration. So it'll say something like, 50% of your devices are configured, but the other 50% are not. So you better extend the configuration. And from here, I can start the flow of requesting this remediation, where it will take me through a wizard again. Here we are doing like this bridging between security operations and IT, and just completing this wizard creates a task for the IT analyst to do this.
Okay, perfect. So, Corina, this was a lot to digest, a lot to remember. Luckily, we can all watch the recording again. Um, so let's summarize. We had part one where we looked into ransomware, this threat in general, what are the techniques and tactics, and how they usually operate. We discussed automated attack disruption, and we looked into the incident that you brought with you as our demo example, and started to identify the individual assets that are important for us to then investigate. And then we basically looked into that playbook that we have that walks people through solving an incident, and in this case the ransomware incident, by make sure you contain the specific assets. Those are the investigation steps to make sure nothing has been left behind, and all these things. And then recovery, and making sure assets get back online if they have been isolated or disabled. And just now, very important piece was, how can someone prevent such an attack in the future to happen again? Are there any last recommendations from you, Corina, for someone who might be either new to the console or new to doing some investigation using Microsoft 365 Defender? Some tips and tricks, some last words for to our audience.
First of all, watch the ninja videos. There is an entire library of them, and actually, I think this series now is very focused on investigations and We have different examples for different types of threats. Obviously, what we do here may vary in reality in your case, right? So you need to see how you adapt. Some organizations will have their own procedures for handling different cases, so it will be maybe customized one way or another. And really, the biggest recommendation, first of all, use incidents. It's a great tool to see the full scope of an attack. Don't go alert by alert because you're only going to be looking through the keyhole of things like this. And just to identify that there's something big going on, it's really, really important. These are very powerful tools that system is providing, and I hope people take advantage of them. Um, and then, always, be curious, look into all the different angles, and certainly, prevent. It's the best thing to do. Then you can, go out to the beach instead of having to deal with these incidents.
I wish it was that easy. Corina,
Yeah.
thank you so much for presenting this ransomware incident response episode, or like these two, for taking your time, for preparing, and for explaining everything so clear. So even I, as you saw during the episode, understood a few things. And thanks everyone for watching, and I hope you tune in for the next episode here on the Virtual Ninja. So talk soon.